McDonald's is worried about its fries. Not at one location, not in one city. Across the American Midwest, managers are recalculating portion sizes, Burger King franchises are quietly rationing supply, Wendy's locations in several states are pulling large fries from promotional menus altogether. And the reason isn't drought in Idaho or a labor strike in California. The reason is sitting in refrigerated warehouses in Prince Edward Island, Alberta, and Manitoba. $3.9 billion worth of frozen French fries that used to flow south across the border without a second thought until Mark Carney decided American fast food is not Canada's problem anymore. Trump demanded priority access to Canadian potatoes. He framed it as food security. He argued that integrated North American supply chains give the United States a legitimate claim to Canadian agricultural output. He suggested Canada should guarantee supply to American restaurants before serving anyone else. He called it strategic necessity, economic integration, a simple request between neighbors. Carney's response was 4 words: Canadian potatoes feed Canadians. And just like that, 78% of American frozen French fry imports became conditional. Not banned, not embargoed, conditional. The United States imports roughly 1.6 million tons of frozen fries annually. Around 1.4 million tons come from Canada. That supply, once automatic, is now subject to Canadian priorities. Domestic food security, export diversification, market-based allocation instead of political obligation. Today, potatoes are the newest front in the Canada-United States trade confrontation. But what looks like a fight over fries is really about leverage. Who controls the supply chain and who sets the terms? Potatoes are Canada's 5th largest crop, generating about $2.3 billion in annual farm receipts. But the real money isn't in fresh produce. It's in processed frozen fries, a $3.1 billion export machine with nearly 92% historically flowing to the United States. American potato production has stagnated in recent years. Processing capacity is concentrated in the Pacific Northwest. Meanwhile, fast food demand remains relentless. Every major U.S. chain depends on predictable year-round frozen supply, and much of that supply originates in Canadian soil. Prince Edward Island produces high-starch potatoes, ideal for frying. Alberta and Manitoba host large-scale processing plants owned by multinational food giants. The system works because it has always been predictable. Harvest, processing, freezing, shipping, fryers on. Trump looked at that dependency and saw leverage. If Canada needs American markets for its fries, threatening access should force compliance on tariffs, trade disputes, resource negotiations, use potatoes as a pressure point, demand guaranteed supply contracts, tie agricultural access to broader concessions. But Carney looked at the same data and saw vulnerability. Not American vulnerability, but Canadian vulnerability. If one buyer controls 88% of your export market, that's not partnership, that's exposure. And exposure becomes dangerous the moment trade is weaponized. This is not the first time Canada has faced that realization. Oil, lumber, steel, critical minerals. In each case, American political pressure exposed how dependent Canada had become on a single dominant customer. And in each case, diversification became strategy. While Trump was making demands, Canadian producers were booking flights, trade missions to Indonesia, meetings in Manila, negotiations in Tokyo. Canada has been working quietly on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia, where tariff reductions on agricultural products, including frozen potato goods, are already outlined in draft frameworks. The ASEAN trade talks ongoing since 2020 represent access to a bloc of 670 million consumers with rapidly expanding middle classes and fast food markets, growing faster than North America's. Japan already imports significant volumes of Canadian fries. Mexico's purchases have steadily increased. European markets, particularly Belgium and France themselves, global potato giants, present competitive but lucrative opportunities. The difference is not just price, the difference is political risk. These markets do not threaten tariffs every election cycle. They do not demand guaranteed priority access framed as strategic entitlement. From an economic standpoint, this shift is rational. The The global frozen potato market is projected to surpass $83 billion by the end of the decade. Demand growth is strongest in Southeast Asia and Latin America. Rising incomes translate directly into quick-service restaurant expansion. If Canada can secure even incremental market share increases outside the United States, dependence falls rapidly. What does that mean for American chains? It means fries are no longer automatic. McDonald's does not own potato farms. Burger King does not operate freezing plants. Wendy's contracts suppliers who contract processors who rely on Canadian farmers. The entire system rests on trust and predictability. Once predictability erodes, costs rise, contracts shorten, insurance premiums increase, menu planning becomes unstable. And here's the quiet shift happening beneath the headlines. Canada is treating American buyers exactly as customers, not as entitled stakeholders. Customers compete, customers negotiate, customers pay market rates. They do not dictate national production priorities. The visible consequence is shrinking fry portions. The invisible consequence is structural. Canadian farmers are learning that dependence on the United States is a choice, not destiny. Asian contracts are insurance policies. European distribution deals are leverage. Mexican buyers represent optionality. Potatoes are not strategic like oil. But the principle is identical. When trade becomes a weapon, suppliers adapt, and adaptation changes power. This is not about banning exports. It is about removing guarantees. The United States can still buy Canadian fries if it competes for them. Trump's demand was not subtle. He wanted Canada to guarantee priority access for American food companies, not simply maintain exports, but lock them in. Fix supply agreements. First claim on production regardless of global demand. The justification was food security. The argument was integration. Decades of trade, he suggested, created obligations. The implied threat was equally clear. Refuse to guarantee supply and tariffs follow. Redirect exports to Asia or Europe and access to the US market could be blocked entirely. Use agricultural exports as leverage and retaliation would spill into every sector of the Canadian economy. It was a familiar playbook. Identify a Canadian resource American industries depend on. Frame it as strategically necessary to the United States. Demand guaranteed access. Attach consequences. We've seen it with oil pipelines. We've seen it with softwood lumber. We've seen it with steel and aluminum tariffs. And now potatoes. But this time, Canadian farmers and processors saw it coming. They had watched how dependent became vulnerability. When US administrations imposed tariffs on lumber, Canadian mills scrambled. When energy infrastructure was politicized, Canadian crude exports became uncertain. The lesson was clear. If one market can threaten you, you need others. So, Canada began executing diversification quietly, deliberately. Prince Edward Island growers weren't just selling potatoes, they were building trade relationships. Indonesia's rapidly expanding fast food sector represents millions of new consumers annually. The Philippines is experiencing urban growth that directly correlates with quick's service demand. ASEAN negotiations, though complex, prioritize agricultural access. Each signed memorandum, each tariff reduction represents incremental independence. Japan remains a stable premium buyer. Mexican demand for frozen fries continues to climb, particularly as domestic fast food franchises expand. European buyers, especially in markets where processing capacity fluctuates seasonally, present opportunities for Canadian processors to compete on quality and reliability. Every new contract signed outside the United States reduces political exposure. Now, consider the American side. The US imports roughly 1.58 million tons of frozen fries annually. Around 84% of that historically comes from Canada. Processing facilities in Alberta and Manitoba supply product designed to exact specifications of American chains. Logistics networks are optimized for cross-border shipping. Refrigerated trucking routes operate on tight timelines, disrupt even 12% of that flow, and restaurant operations feel it immediately. Fast food margins are thin. Ingredient costs are calculated down to the cent. When supply uncertainty enters the equation, chains must hedge. That means higher procurement costs, shorter-term contracts, alternative suppliers, often at inferior scale. Idaho and Washington state producers cannot instantly fill the gap. Building new processing capacity takes years and hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investment, and here lies the broader economic reality. Supply chains built over decades cannot be reshaped overnight. American chains are discovering something uncomfortable. Their fries were never American in origin as assumed. They were continental, integrated, and integration works only when both sides treat it as partnership, not leverage. Carney's position is straightforward. Canadian agriculture serves Canadian priorities first. If there is surplus, it is sold to whoever offers market terms without political strings attached. That position resonates domestically. Food security has become a global concern. Climate volatility, supply chain disruptions, pandemic aftershocks. Governments worldwide are reassessing export guarantees. Canada, with its vast agricultural capacity, has room to prioritize internally without triggering shortages. From a geopolitical perspective, Carney's move signals something deeper than potatoes. It signals a structural shift in Canada's trade posture. No longer automatic alignment, no longer reflexive accommodation, instead conditional engagement. Oil provides a parallel. Canadian crude increasingly flows to Asia via expanded pipeline capacity to the Pacific coast. Every barrel sold to non-US buyers reduces single market dependency. Lumber trade agreements with Europe and Asia serve similar logic. Critical minerals processing is moving domestic to avoid raw material export reliance. The potato confrontation fits into that broader doctrine. Trump interpreted Canadian potatoes feed Canadians as escalation. But from Ottawa's standpoint, it is policy consistency, sovereignty over resources, no guaranteed priority access, no assumption of entitlement. And here is the economic irony. By threatening to weaponize Canadian exports, the United States accelerated Canada's diversification strategy. Pressure created incentive. Incentive produced alternatives. Alternatives reduced leverage. Meanwhile, American consumers are beginning to notice smaller portions, limited time substitutions, quiet menu adjustments. Franchise operators facing volatile input costs are pushing corporate headquarters for solutions. But there is no immediate fix. Building new domestic processing plants requires regulatory approval, capital expenditure, and agricultural acreage expansion. Potatoes may seem trivial in geopolitical terms, but supply chain interdependence is not trivial. If food products become politicized, energy products can follow. If agricultural exports are framed as obligations, water, electricity, or minerals could be next in line for demands. Carney is drawing a line not because fries are strategic, but because precedent is. If Canada concedes guaranteed priority access on potatoes, it legitimizes the principle that U.S. strategic needs override Canadian sovereignty in any sector deemed important. That is the line Ottawa refuses to cross. And so the visible image, empty fryers, masks a larger shift. Canadian producers are no longer operating from dependency. They are operating from optionality. When suppliers have options, buyers lose leverage. This is not just about potatoes. It never was. What we are witnessing is a structural recalibration of North American economic power. Not in dramatic headlines about oil embargoes or steel tariffs, but in something far more subtle, the removal of guarantees. For decades, American industries built business models around the assumption that Canadian supply was automatic. Oil would flow south. Lumber would cross the border. Electricity would power northern U.S. grids. Frozen fries would fill American fryers. That assumption is dissolving. Canadian resources are becoming conditional instead of guaranteed. Oil, lumber, steel, electricity, critical minerals, and now potatoes are all following the same logic. The resource itself hasn't changed. The ownership hasn't changed. What has changed is the negotiating posture. American industries built dependency on Canadian supply because it was efficient. Canada is geographically close, politically stable, and historically cooperative. That cooperation created integration. Integration created reliance. Reliance created vulnerability on both sides. But when Trump framed Canadian agricultural output as something that should automatically serve American needs first, the principle shifted from partnership to entitlement. And once entitlement enters the equation, sovereignty becomes the counterweight. Look at oil. Canada remains the largest foreign supplier of crude to the United States, sending millions of barrels per day across the border. But expanded export capacity to the Pacific has opened Asian markets. Every shipment that heads west rather than south slightly reduces American negotiating leverage. It's not a cutoff, it's optionality. Look at lumber. For decades, US-Canada lumber disputes have cycled through tariffs and countermeasures. Now, Canadian producers are expanding relationships in Europe and Asia. Again, not abandonment, diversification. Electricity follows the same pattern. Provinces are strengthening interprovincial transmission infrastructure, reducing automatic southbound flows. Hydropower that once flowed predictably into US grids is increasingly tied to domestic resilience planning. Critical minerals tell perhaps the clearest story. Rather than exporting raw lithium, nickel, and cobalt for processing abroad, often in the United States, Canada is investing in domestic refining and battery supply chains. That move alone could reshape North American manufacturing leverage over the next decade. And then there is water, the resource Trump once floated as a solution to American drought crisis. Carney's position was unequivocal. Canadian water is non-negotiable. Potatoes sit within that continuum. Why should anyone care about French fries in a trade war? Because precedent matters. If food security becomes a justification for guaranteed access, energy security can follow. If agricultural integration implies obligation, mineral access might be next. Carney is drawing a boundary at the smallest visible resource, precisely because it reinforces the larger principle. Canadian production serves Canadian priorities. Exports are commercial transactions, not strategic entitlements. Economically, this reflects a broader global trend. Nations are rethinking supply chain exposure after years of hyperglobalization. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities. The Russia-Ukraine war reshaped energy flows. Strategic competition between major powers has turned trade into a policy instrument. In that environment, diversification is no longer optional. It is insurance. Canada's move on potatoes is an insurance policy. From Washington's perspective, escalation seems predictable. Tariffs on frozen fries, retaliatory measures targeting other sectors, political rhetoric framing Canada as obstructive, but escalation carries costs. American consumers feel food price inflation immediately. Fast food chains operate on razor-thin margins. Even small cost increases ripple outward through franchise networks. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics already tracks food price volatility as a sensitive political indicator. Any prolonged supply disruption, even symbolic, creates pressure. Meanwhile, Canadian producers are adapting quickly. Contracts with Asian distributors are being structured with flexibility. European importers are negotiating multi-year supply guarantees. Mexican chains are expanding procurement relationships northward. Each signed deal reduces reliance on one buyer. And here is the strategic shift that matters most. Canadian farmers are discovering they have leverage. For decades, market access to the United States felt indispensable. Now, incremental diversification is proving otherwise. Leverage changes, negotiation, psychology. When Trump threatens tariffs, Canadian processors can point to alternative markets. When American buyers demand priority, Canadian exporters can respond with competitive bidding. The balance of power is not flipping. The United States remains the larger economy by far, but dependency is recalibrating, and recalibration reduces asymmetry. Trump wanted guaranteed access to Canadian potatoes. Instead, he received market competition. He wanted priority claims, he received par, he wanted subordination. He encountered sovereignty. The lesson unfolding is identical to the one oil already taught. You cannot threaten the country that controls your supply chain and expect the supply chain to function as if nothing changed. Threats create incentives. Incentives create alternatives. Alternatives dilute leverage. American fast food chains' shrinking portion sizes may seem trivial, but symbolically, it represents the visible edge of a much deeper economic transition. North American integration is not dissolving, it is being renegotiated. Carney's 4 words, Canadian potatoes feed. Canadians are less a declaration of economic war than a declaration of negotiating posture. Domestic priorities first, commercial terms second, political demands rejected, everything else is negotiable. The question now is not whether fries will return to American menus in full portions. They likely will. Markets adapt. Contracts get signed. Trade flows continue. The real question is whether automatic entitlement has ended. Because once guarantees disappear, every transaction becomes negotiation.